Thanks for listening to Fluff and Crunch, where we talk about the connection and sometimes disconnect between system, setting, and story in tabletop RPGs. Now I'm recording. Okay, now I'm not an idiot any longer. So you had elections and a turnover of the government and exciting football stuff. Okay. I had 4th of July and a trip to Florida and back. And have you done any gaming in this last week?
I mean, we've carried on playing ISS Vanguard. So again, we had another kind of role-playing type decision thing where we literally in the mission because of something we did. Why was it? Oh yeah, like the ship that our drop ship gets destroyed and we have to like climb up this thing for someone else to get evac. And then it plays this thing that basically not all the characters could fit on the ship. It was too heavy because of the high winds. So one of us had to choose to stay behind.
Good.
We're like, wow,
success at a cost.
Harsh. So yeah, so Brian for this, like, I don't know, second time, and I went, yep, I'll leave my guy. This character's crap. I'll die. You survive. So the security department, it's quite appropriate actually, because it's the security department. So essentially the red/yellow shirts that are so far 2 men down. It might be 2 women actually, but still. So it's quite funny.
Good.
So they wear blue shirts in this, or at least his color coding for security is blue. But yeah, they be dying a lot. How about you?
We played Castles and Crusades. We finally got back to Kingmaker this last weekend. Shocking. Finally. And got things going again, had some stuff happen. I think we were able to actually using some of the ideas that we had talked about a while back about resurrecting a campaign. Some of those things are put to use, and now we have successfully blown the dust off of it. But now we're not going to play it again until August because we have people out over the next few weeks. So we'll have to blow the dust off it all over again in a month.
Just give up on it. Just bin it and start something else.
I'm not going to bin it until my players are grouchy and all that stuff and we all agree. No. Actually, I felt pretty hopeful and optimistic, pretty positive after the session this last weekend. So we'll see how it goes. But that taking or moving away from that I don't know if that brings us to, it doesn't really bring us to our topic, not at all. We can just move to our topic. You have been working on some dice mechanics or ideas for dice mechanics.
Yeah.
You have been for your game.
I have far too many ideas.
You do. And I want to narrow these things down. I want to understand them better because you sent me some notes. Sent me some pages and notes. Do you want me to put those as...
Oh yeah, you can send a link to it in the thing. Because when I sent you this idea, it was on idea 4. And now it's up to 7. And the 7th idea is a work in progress.
So again, give me the quick elevator pitch reminder, not so much for me, but for maybe people who missed the episode where you talked about your idea for a game. What is the idea? And then let's go into some of these ideas for dice mechanics that you think might work and be fitting for that.
I mean, kind of like you were like, yeah, you moaned at me for saying I had to have a setting and then just went, I'm doing horror. It's like, that's not a setting, that's a genre. I'm going for sort of this high action. My most idea is like when you watch a trailer for a film or a computer game and all the high action, really cool stuff. So borderline anime, computer game, certain film things. That's what I'm going for. So characters that can do more interesting stuff. But because then there's a really wide variety of characters, it needs to be able to handle a lot of stuff. So I'm not going high level soup. This isn't a superhero game, so I don't have to worry about someone playing, Hulk or Thor or someone. But also it's not meant to be just like, average Joe. So it's not a Mutant Year Zero engine, just you're playing kids and they have very few skills. So people should either be highly skilled or have lots of gear or they have some level of powers. But I need something to handle lots of different stuff because actually, And there might be systems out there that can, have a passable, I could do this in Mutants and Masterminds, but that's a superheroes game. But the point is, I don't want a superheroes game. And like Cortex Prime Marvel Heroic, that would do it. But then that game is for doing comic book action. And the minute you're not doing the comic book action, it doesn't do the other stuff. There's no role playing mechanics in there. So I want to be able to do other things as, just that I want to be able to do really cool combat scenes, but I don't want it to just be cool combat scenes.
And that's tough, actually, because it really, like, mechanically, those, I mean, I think that's a complaint that people have made about every version of D&D, is that, I mean, really, no matter how much you talk about role play and intrigue and even exploration, it's really basically a combat focused game, and the system reflects that. So what are you thinking? What are some of your ideas to work around this?
So some of this fall down to kind of other things that I like the idea of. Like I want a dice pool. One of the systems that I really looked at and I really like is City of Mist, which entirely uses tags, but then and I'll get back to that, but it just uses a 2d6 roll, and a 2d6 plus roll breaks down really quickly. The minute you're on, I think mathematically it's +4, it's almost broken, but the minute you're adding 5 to your 2d6 roll, it breaks the Powered by the Apocalypse straight away. And most Powered by the Apocalypse games are fine because they only have a +1, 2, 3, like old school D and like Dungeon World. You only have +1, 2, 3, so it's fine. But the minute you hit +4, which you can do in Dungeon, it breaks. City of Mist, you can potentially hit +5 and +6, so it actually will break its own maths. So I don't like a 2d6. I don't want a 1d21. We've talked about this. I would like to do a dice pull. So one of my first ideas very early on, I'm skipping, a couple of early ideas was, I like the idea of I want to do a dice pull. That's one thing. I'd like to have different dice types within that dice pool. Now, one reason for this is pretty much because because partly I don't want to pick one. I don't want to have to go, I'm just using D8s or I'm just using D10s or D12s or D6s. I had someone on Reddit to me just go, just use a D6 dice pool. And it's like, but everyone else has already used a D6 dice pool. And also D6s are dull. I know this because I have other D6 dice games, and it's, part of the rolling dice is fun, but also new is fun to some extent. Like Genesis and the Star Wars games, the first time you play those, this is fun because I'm rolling different kinds of dice. And then after I realized the thing is, but I'm counting all these different symbols and it's fiddly and annoying. But it crossed my mind to do something along those lines of, is there a way I can use D10s and D8s and D12s and D6s? And that's what I was looking at. So skip idea work. There's nothing in that. So my idea, we'll start with this is idea 2. This is what is written on the file, is that you roll a mixture of D10s, D8s, D6, and D12s, which sounds crazy. So the base roll, though, is D10s and D8s, where D10s would be your skills. And I think I went with let's say roughly 1 to 4. And D8s were for, D8s are for stats. So it's basically saying skills are more important than stats. I've done that straight off the bat. That's what I've done with that. And then I'll also throw in D6 and D12s there. The D6s are kind of irrelevant. There's a silly thing in there. Essentially, if you roll 1s on your dice, you'll get complications. So if there's a chance if there's something like kind of disadvantage, the kind of thing, it doesn't work in 2d20, but in Genesis, the thing that would give you a disadvantage dice, the only thing that would matter on that dice really is rolling a 1. So if you throw in a couple of them, you've got more chance of getting a 1.
So, okay, real quick, so I'll make sure I'm clear. So what you're talking about is the most basic roll would involve a D8 and a D10.
It'd be a couple of D8s and a couple of D10s. So it'd be, let's say you've got a skill of 3 and a stat of 2. You'd roll 2 D8s and 3 D. Okay.
So you're
or the other one, whichever. So you'd roll 5 dice.
And then now the die 6. Is that something you would always roll, or you would only add in a die 6, which would create a complicating factor on a 1? You would only add that in a situation where that could be a possibility, or is it always
that what you just said?
Okay, all right, that's so you're always going to roll some D8s and D10s, but whether you're going to roll 6s or 12s varies.
Yeah, and the 12s are therefore the opposites. The 12s are your luck dice. So meta currency could give you a D12, or if you had an advantage for some reason, that could be a D12. I think I then toyed with the idea of if you had a focus or a speciality, that'd be a D12. So like a decent roll, you might be rolling 2 or 3 d8s for your stats, and then like 2 or 3 d10s for your skills. I can't remember it, and then a d12. And the target number I went with was 7. So a 7 means 6 can't hit it, so you don't have to worry about rolling it on your bad dice. So a 7 or above, which obviously only the 8, 9, 10, the 8, 10, and 12 can do. And the 11 and 12 would be a double success, because obviously these go to 11. That's why I want to roll a d12. And that'd be it. That was a relatively straightforward, and you would count the number of successes, and you'd be going for sort of similar to 2d20. The 1 would be, 1 would be average difficulty, and 2 would be high difficulty, and so that.
Okay, so
that was that idea.
So let me make sure I get this. So roll a 7 or above.
Yeah.
And any die is a success. And then you
Yes.
need a certain number of successes to be successful. So that
Yes.
means on each attribute die, you would have a 25% chance of being successful. Okay.
Yeah.
And on each skill die, 7, 8, 9, 10, 7, 8, 9, 10, you would have a 40% chance of being successful.
Yeah.
And then if you rolled a 12, you would
50.
have a 50% chance of being successful on the die 12, but you would have a 1 in 6 chance of being doubly successful. Okay.
Yes.
Now, have you, we don't need to get into it unless you want to the degree that you want. Have you run the like probabilities on your, because one of the things that I ran into that I think I'm happy with the outcome, and after a couple of play tests thus far, I have not been proved wrong. I'm feeling good about it. Is where I really I had to put a lot of effort early on with my system was an average character who is generally proficient in a skill. How often should that character be successful? And based on the probabilities, based on the dice type and the die type and the success numbers that I decided on, I hit a point where I'm probability wise happy, because then as you become a more proficient, more able character, your probability goes up, and if you are less so, obviously it goes down. But for me, establishing that average proficient person is going to be successful about this amount of the time, where does that fall for you? And I know that this complicates things. Your system complicates things because you're using multiple die types.
Yeah, I mean, I had a look at it, and then I realized I was miscalculating one of the percentages, but like just getting difficulty 1, so 1 success across, if you're rolling 2 stat dice and 1 skill dice, which was that seemed pretty average. That was like a 66% chance of getting 1 success, but I think it might be higher than that because I messed it up calculating it, because I was doing the numbers, but then I realized I made a mistake. Having done this huge page of numbers, I realized I'd made a mistake in all of the calculations, and I didn't bother to go back and do it again. 2 successes then, where for something to be like more difficult, would be like way lower than that, but not out of the question.
I settled on about 2/3. That average proficient person would be successful about 2/3 of the time, and you think, oh wow, that's kind of low, but that's under. You only roll when it matters, when the situation is stressful.
That's where mine is about for that one. So that was the first thing. And see, they've got things later which actually could come back to that same idea, but with tweaks, and then a completely totally different stuff. But yeah, that was the basic idea. There was tweaks to things. I put a thing in where if you rolled 666 across all the dice, it means something, and then I'm like, oh, that'd be a pain, and you'd forget it all the time.
No way, man. Then you have to play an Iron Maiden song.
Yeah, so I liked it, but then I was like, I can just, and also they like it with the 10s and the 12s. You're like, oh, is that a 6 or a 9? And it's, so I don't know about it. So that's one of the things that's a maybe. I think the original thing I wrote down is that's an auto fail. And I was like, no, I don't like auto fails, because you could succeed and then fail. So that'd be.
I think something really dreadful happens if you roll 666.
But it'd be
I don't think it's a problem, because your freaking dice have a little line under the 9. So that's if you can't tell that I can't help you if you can't work with that. You players out there.
But that's one that might have to be. I think the problem would be you just forget it, because it wouldn't come up very often. You would forget.
That's true. But I think it would be noticeable.
Yeah. So
Real quick
that's something to
question.
look at. Yeah,
Quick question before you move into more details about this, because actually I'm intrigued now.
that's
The
literally
notes
just
that you sent
that's
me.
an idea. I mean, there is no more detail on that before
Okay.
different ideas I then had. So yeah,
The
ask the
notes
question.
that you sent me, they now make a lot more sense for that system. And initially, I've only played one game that used multiple dice type or die types in one roll, and that was Eclipse Phase, and that was kind of a nightmare. And so initially, I was like, "Oh, yuck!" But
Eclipse
then,
phase is just percentage.
no. But no, the version I played, the stats were based off of multiple different dice types or die types. It was so strange. Anyway, this makes sense. This actually makes sense. And you know, the now this is yours is a real live dice pool system, not a the year zero step die system. You chances are will use different die types, although you'll only use one of each because
Yeah.
you're only rolling one for a skill and one for a stat. I like this idea because you know it's fun to have a handful of dice and the fact that you're not adding makes things pretty quick. You know, I could see quickly sorting your your eights over here, your tens over here, and then looking at the numbers or something like that. And and you're making a statement that skills are more important than stats, that you know you max out a stat but a skill can go farther. Okay, I can live with that. And I like the idea of your adding in the 6 or the 12 when an interesting situation would call for it. Now, I don't know if you've thought at all about meta currencies or anything like that, but would could you see on the player side the player using a meta currency to like force a die 6 on the GM or
I mean,
put an add a 12 to their
yeah,
pool?
that's one of the things I said that D12 could be useful was if I had a meta currency, then meta currencies would buy you D12s because that's the good dice. So yes.
I think that would be
Um,
cool too, because then you could, you know, you as the player could spend that to either benefit yourself or spend it to, okay, hey GM, the bad guy's got to add a die 6, or here's and maybe it's an increasing cost. You add, you know, two sixes to the pool or something like that. I think that provides some neat options.
So the next idea is really a variation on that, which purely came down to the fact that I was like, oh, potentially might be rolling a lot of dice. I mean, not a huge amount of dice, but a reasonable amount, you know, not Shadowrun or Exalted style dice, but you could easily be rolling in theory, if both the stats go up to sort of 3 or 4, and then you've also got some D6 that you could potentially be rolling 10 dice. So the next one was a tiny variation taking kind of how it works in Genesis and Star Wars, where rather than having skill and stat dice, you have base dice and expertise dice. So you take your stat and this is how it works in Genesis. So in Genesis, it'll be like your stats 2 and your skills 1. You roll 2 dice, and one of them's the good one and one of them's the bad. One of them's the not as good dice. So then if you had a skill and stat both are 2, because they're the same, you just roll 2 of the good dice. So I thought about doing that, but it's a similar thing that you would roll. Like you look at how many dice you've got. Like you look at your stat and skill. You don't add them together. Just the whichever one is highest, you're going to roll that many dice in total, and whichever one is lower, you will roll a d8 because that's the less good one essentially. Oh no, or the other way around. I can't remember it. So I wrote an example of this because I couldn't remember. Did I write an example? Somewhere I wrote an example of this because I couldn't remember how it worked. Yeah. So like hypothetically, you have a stat of 4 and a skill of 2. In total, you're going to be rolling 4 dice. You're going to roll 2 base dice, which would be d8s, and 2 expertise dice, or d10s. And then this reminded me why I don't really like it in Genesis, because it's actually way more complicated to explain and way more complicated in practice than should
Yeah.
literally just be, all right, because on Genesis it's easy because you've color coded it. So you've
Yeah.
color coded on your skill. I'm going to have, when I roll, I'm going to have this plus this, and it's always the same. So I'm not, and other than that, it's very similar. This gives you, it's rolling less dice, which means then I can increase what the stats. So I've then put the stats going up to 5 and skills going up to 5. So that gives me more granularity on stats and skills, which is good. Because I can only therefore ever roll. The most I could roll is 5 dice because I can't roll more than 5 dice.
Okay.
So that's the thing I like there, is that it gives me more granularity on both the stat and the skill. Because on the other one, I didn't want to go up to 5 as max stat and 5 as max skill, because then you can roll, like, which is what you do in, say, World of Darkness, because then you can roll 10 dice. But in World of Darkness, you roll 10 dice and you stop. Whereas Shadowrun you know, exalted as you roll in up to, 20 dice, and then it's getting silly. So that was my first one. I kind of capped it at, well, I don't want to be rolling that many dice. Plus, there's those D12s in there as well. So I brought the amount of dice down. Whereas here, this is a way of bringing the dice down, but increasing the stats because they overlap each other.
Real quick,
but I think it's fiddly.
I hadn't thought about it, but real quick, how about roughly, is there a cap on the number of dice you would ever roll in the previous idea, or do you have a general idea about what would be the max?
So I've got the stats was the maximum stat of 4 and a maximum skill of 3, but then if you have a focus, you get to roll in the D12s.
Okay.
So realistically, your highest would be 8 dice plus any D6s you rolled and any meta currency you'd rolled.
Okay.
But that in theory means you could be rolling like 8, 9, 10, 11 dice max.
Yeah, I capped mine at 10, like period. Yeah. 10 is always, no matter, I mean, and stat plus skill, you could, the maximum you could ever have from that would be 9, and then, a modifier. But okay, that's not, look, I actually don't think even, I mean, 10 to 12 dice as an outlier, that's not an obscene amount of dice.
Yeah.
I mean, because it would be unusual. It'd be kind of neat. Like, oh my gosh, all these dice. Let's just make sure they don't go flying all over the place. Now, what do you see as the comparative advantages or disadvantages or attraction points? I know you mentioned one already, a disadvantage potentially.
I think I prefer the initial idea because I think it's just simpler. Just grab all your skill dice, grab all your stat dice. This just has that extra level of, right, okay, well, I've got my highest of the skill and stat is 4. So I'm going to be rolling 4 dice, and my lower is my secondary thing is, or the better one is 3, so I get 3 of this. I think just be fiddly, and I think it was easier in Genesis because they were color coded. You knew that you needed like 3 yellows and a green because that's what it said in your character sheet. That wouldn't work here because you're using D8s and D10s, so it's not obviously which one is which. So
I mean, you could say, like, your attribute dice are blue and your skill dice are green, and then I think you could have 4 different colors.
Yeah, when you've got skills and stats, when you've got this idea of sort of base dice and expertise dice, I think it's just harder to like work it out. So,
I see what you're saying.
And all the benefits really get, and also the numbers, the percentages work away. Like the difficulties have to be way lower. Like the minute I'm trying to go up to, like, if I was trying to use the difficulty again of sort of 0, 1, 2, like very like 2D20, those higher difficulties just don't hit at all because you're rolling way less dice.
Sure.
Because a stat, like a really good stat of 5 and 5, and the other one is 5d8s and 5d10s. Here, it's still 5. It's 5d10s. So you lose all those d8s, and suddenly the most you can roll is 5. So the percentages drop way down. So then you have to bring the difficulty ratings down. So actually, the only benefit of this is that you're rolling less dice, so I can have higher stat and skill values. But realistically, I could just do higher stat and skill values for the original one, and just, oh, well, you might have to roll more dice. It's like you said, it's 1 or 2 more dice. It's not, although the top's way high, but it's like maybe we get up to 12 dice instead of this goes up to sort of 7. So I'm not.
I think the first one, sometimes things have an intuitive appeal, then you start peeling back the layers and you're like, too complicated or not worth it or whatever. But now that you've explained the two of them, the first one definitely has an intuitive appeal, but there's also, the more I think about it, it sounds like I could see that being workable. What I mean by workable as a practice. Like, okay, I'm going to pick up these dice and I'm going to roll them, and this is how I'm going to adjudicate and deal with the numbers, and that, like the actual, just the physical / low-level mental practice of doing the mechanic. I could totally see working easily at the table and being different enough that, I mean, look, different and novel has value. It perks up people's interest. They maybe pay attention a little bit more because it's not the same darn thing over and over again. So I could see it having that. And I could also seeing it as a mechanic that feeds the story, having some expressions that would be interesting, like this idea of, under what circumstances would the GM add D6s or D12s, and how does that, if you have a meta currency, which you must, we like those, under what circumstances would you, as a player or a GM, be able to purchase or work with those to add them either to benefit yourself or to cause harm or a pain in the butt to, to the GM by dumping D6s on them? Um, yeah, actually, I think you should work on that. I really
I
think
mean,
that.
of the original ones, like of my original four, that's the one I prefer because then I had this other die where you always roll 6 dice and you're moving dice up and down, but it's weird and I can't even remember the reason for it. It's just because
Look,
it's 6d6, which sounds nice, but not, that's just like that's a no. Um, so the other one that though is the one I have been toying with more is because it's looking more into sort of the cortex and looking more into the City of Mist idea of actually having a like because one of the problems I have with that is that it's very much stat plus skill, and I'm not sold on stat plus skill because I need characters where their gear is really important or their powers are really important, and that doesn't fit into stat plus skill at all. So when I look at something like City of Mist, the idea is you and also the character creation works better. So the character creation in City of Mist, you literally have 4 like groups of stuff. So you go, right, my character has resources, kind of like merits to some extent like that in World Done. But you go, right, I've got something from resources, which might give you some equipment options. And then you go, right, so I can do magic. So I have this, I can cast fireballs and shoot lightning out my eyes or whatever. And then you go, oh, well, I've got skills. You have some skill things. Oh, I've got some money. And they give you tags. Now, those tags can be used both in and out of combat in City of Mist because it's like Power by the Pockets. You roll, you work out which tags are applicable. Every one gives you a point, and you add, you get 3 points, and you add
yeah,
that to your 2d6 roll. Now that's easy enough to then turn into a right. Well, those will be dice. If I have 3, I'm going to roll 3 dice. But why I had the idea is, well, actually, rather than just then that's exactly like City Mist, I would go more Cortex type thing, and they'd each have a dice rating. So all of these different things, so I maybe have 10, 12, 15 different tags, and each tag would have a dice rating going from D6, which is not very, or maybe D4 for really bad, but probably D6 up to D12. And you would pick the relevant tags and you would roll those dice. And then I had different ways of how I was working the difficult, but that would be the idea. You would look at your list of different tags and go, right, because I'm doing this, I'm good at shooting. So I've got that. I've got my gun. So I get my dice from my gun. Kind of what you do in things like Marvel Heroic, except that's always distinction, speciality, and 1 or 2 power sets. So this would be any tags that are relevant. I got that tag and that tag and that tag. I put them together. I roll it. It gives me my, and then I've got different things for what I was working out for difficulty. So one I had is actually the difficulty is rolled, and you're trying to beat the difficulty, but actually it'd be easy enough to go either a set difficulty or like we did, or however many successes. There are different ways I could deal with that. It was the collecting the dice and that's the one I'm still playing because I like the idea of tags, but then I've been looking into it again and looking more into like the City of Mist thing and going where it's good that it can count for anything.
yeah.
Where it's not good is the problem you get when you play Cortex, that when a dice is just doing all of this different stuff,
I think I know where you're going.
It stops being that your character can shoot fire or that your character can do this other thing, and everything is a dice.
It starts to turn into mush.
Yeah, that it stops feeling like anything special. And that's kind of where I was starting to get through at point today when I was looking at this again and reading through a whole bunch of the City of Mist stuff going, actually, there's a lot of things like the idea sounds good. And when you start putting it in practice, you go, well,
I think the trouble is like with tags, the idea, there's an intuitive appeal, but then you have to start peeling back the layers and seeing if it makes sense. I think the trouble with it is that obviously, and you could say, well, this reflects reality. People are always going to put together their best resources to try to achieve something. The problem with that mechanically is that it would be, I could see this turning into an exercise similar to the problem with drives.
Yes.
Where, every single time your awesome blaster gun with the scope, you're like, well, that would help me intimidate the person. That would help, and then it becomes, like I said, the things just become mush. I wonder though with tags, if you had, and this is where, it's easy to get too fiddly, but maybe if you had different categories and the requirement is that you're limited, like you can only, you have to take one that has to do with your attributes, or you have to take, there'd be certain requirements that you'd have to take, and maybe there's a
well, so that's where I'm starting to move back to beyond that because of exactly the reasons you just said. Okay, the fact that it feels very samey and you always use your best stuff, and also the
Yeah.
minute you're outside of a situation where your tags help, then suddenly you're terrible.
Yeah.
There'll be like situations where you're amazing, and there'll be other situations. So then I started moving maybe towards actually, well, maybe I'll look back to more and more Cortex thing where you will actually, I'll go back to Marvel Heroic, where Marvel Heroic you always roll distinction plus speciality plus affiliation plus 1 or 2 power sets. So most rolls in Marvel Heroic would be 4 or 5 dice. Now, where you have a problem in Marvel Heroic is that's when you're using your powers or your gear. The minute suddenly your gear or your powers don't work, then you'll roll in 3 dice. Now, actually, I wouldn't. So then I have to change how the difficulty works, which is why then I started having a rather than like you've got to get so many successes. That's when I start having ideas of actually, well, maybe I'll have it's how many dice, like just, I don't know, like literally how many dice beat it and not go for it. So just one, 2, you can get successes much easier. Because part of the problem with this is what I was thinking is having like multiple difficulty dice. Like I had a thing of like, I know you roll 3 dice as the difficulties, and then I was getting all mixed up in my head about which way I was doing, as you can see some of the notes. But
Yeah.
trying to play with the fact that when you're rolling a lot less dice, it can't be, well, only some of the dice will succeed, and then you've got difficulty 1, 2, 3. More just going, right, you roll the dice, and as long as you beat this, you always get you always get success. So if 1 die succeeds, you've got 1 success. 2 dice succeeds, you've got your better stuff. Not comparing it to it, getting rid of the idea of the scaling difficulty and doing something else with it. Because we've talked about this, the multiple degrees of freedom. Like the idea of a 7 was because I was rolling those bad D6s. Here, I wouldn't be rolling bad D6s. The idea in Cortex is you're rolling against a set thing. So it'd be, that you'd back to it. Easy would be 3, and medium would be 5, and then difficult would be 7.
See,
and you just to get rid
I
of that.
gotta-
So I'd switch it back to that way.
I have to admit that it's becoming I think it's too complicated.
No, what I was saying now is actually I would go back to think of how
Yeah.
Cortex works. You have a stat plus, but
Yeah.
you'd have your
Yeah, I know, I
stats.
know.
Each your stat would have a dice type. Each of your skills would have a different dice on it. And then also you would have, it would kind of look like Marvel Heroic, except Marvel Heroic, you pick your best 2 dice and add them together. And I wouldn't do that. I would purely go, this is the difficulty you're rolling. This is the number you're rolling against. Right. It's difficulty 4. And just me, every dice that beats a 4 would be a success. That would be.
What if you took
easier.
okay? The idea of tags.
No, I said forget tags.
Well, no. Wait, listen here, because we're back to your first idea.
Well, pup and
Where 6s and 12s are special good, special challenge, special bad, whatever.
Yeah.
What if you not justified, but explained the inclusion of 6s or 12s as being like tag-like in nature? That is, to make sense of them, so it moves beyond just like a meta thing, like I'm going to inflict this bad die on you. It's under certain circumstances, you can invoke different kinds of tags that could be potentially tied to things like scene traits, like it's dark and stormy, therefore your sniper rifle or your rifle's just not going to work. It's going to be harder to hit.
I think that's fine for like scene traits and like character. Where you have a problem is if that's for what your powers or your gear does. Powers and gear are always giving you a D12, which ideally on the one like you're kind of thinking, oh, but essentially you want a different rating for your powers and gear rather than them always giving you a 12.
Well,
that's what I come back
potentially you could situationally, like what if someone has like the awesome blaster or something like that, and it does all this damage. Well, that's the 12, but the GM is like, yeah, but you're firing like into a crowd, so I'm going to throw a 6 at you also because the poop could hit the fan in terms of collateral damage.
And that's why I started thinking maybe I'll just go back to more of an idea of powers and gears are what you do. So this is something I'd written at some point. I wrote down that actually, because I was trying again to get this idea of what am I actually trying to do with the dice. And at one point I had this like much more narrative combat system that you would explain a whole bunch of stuff, and therefore to succeed you'd have to get like really high stuff. But other than that, I was like, well, mostly when I'm rolling, I've gone to the wrong sheet again. Mostly when I'm rolling, you're rolling dice, you're rolling to see like, do I hit someone, or not in combat, you're just rolling to see, do I succeed? In which case, I can't find the sheet I did. Yeah, in which case, actually rolling skill plus stat is fine because the skill plus stat is, do I hit them? Your power or your gear is then what happens when you have hit them, which is then written as a rule. It's not a dice type. It's a thing that happens.
Although I could see
then.
like better gear as being, helping you hit. By the way, we have 3 minutes left.
Yeah. But then better gear is or better skill is giving you +1 to your skill or stat, that
True.
kind of thing, which is fine. It doesn't, then I don't need to give it a dice type. That's part of the thing it does. But because that's when I start thinking, actually, your skill and stat is, do I succeed? And then what happens when you succeeded is based on the power or the gear that you're using, which is actually probably more that I want to go down. Yeah, so I'm still torn in this. It's partly because I want things like, I want statuses and conditions in a lot of games to be a much bigger deal than they are. Most games, conditions are this like secondary. They're not. I want conditions to be a much bigger thing, and that works really well with power, with like a dice type of things, because in Cortex you kind of go, right, well, I've done this, so you have a D8 the status on you that I've applied to you.
Yeah.
That's actually quite hard to do in a lot of systems. Whereas if you're doing a dice, it's easily, because you've applied that thing and you can step up that dice. That's why I'm probably leaning towards that. But I do like the elegance of the skill plus stat works. There's a reason that people use it.
I think if you hang other things on it or attach other things around it, you can make it more than just that stock approach. I think you should focus on that first one. I think you should push the other ones aside because shiny things will drag you off, productivity. I think that you should focus on that one and see how well you can define it and make sense of it, and try to come up with, like, what I worked through combat, and I worked through, aside from just the core resolution mechanic, then you have to see, how does this work in combat, and do I use a different mechanic to do investigations or some other major pillar of character behavior in the game? I would work on those and see what you can do with it, because like I said, the multiple dice thing was initially off-putting, but now that you explain it, I think it sounds pretty cool.
Cool. Yeah, I think the thing is, if I can work out how to get that to work with combat and conditions, then I think it's going to work.
Yeah.
Because otherwise I might go there. But I know the downside of the way, because it's basically Marvel Heroic, and I know that very quickly it felt like these dice don't mean anything.
You can do better.
Yeah, I forget these dice, like the dice stop meaning
you can do better
what they're for. They just mean dice. And then it starts losing it. So
all right. So that's your assignment. You're going to work on that. And if you like what you're listening to, you're supposed to you're supposed to subscribe, you're supposed to ring the bell, you're supposed to do all that good stuff. Listen to the podcast, join the Discord community, and catch up with us next week. Thank you, as always, for listening to Fluff and Crunch. You can join our Discord, you can subscribe to the podcast, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel, all through the links in the show notes. Thanks again. Have a great day. We look forward to talking with you.